Hello, good morning, and welcome to the Ultima Microsoft Licensing webinar for October. My name is Gerrard, and I'm one of the Microsoft licensing consultants for Ultima. And today we'll be looking at how to license the Microsoft Windows Server Data Center. As always, this is going to be a high-level overview into how to do that, some of the frequently asked questions that come up, to give you an idea around the types of questions that you do need to be asking yourself as an organization and what some of those key decision points are. This webinar is being recorded and it will be made available at the end of the webinar as well. If you do have any questions, please don't hesitate to pop them down and I will probably address them at the end of the webinar. Similarly, if there's any subjects that come up which you would like to, well, hopefully there's some subjects that come up, then please contact your Ultima account manager or your licensing specialist, or come to me directly. We'll certainly be able to help. So let's have a quick look across the agenda. We'll start with looking at the Windows Server and how to license Windows Server in an on-premise environment. I'll also cover off how you access that Windows Server as well, because that's something else that comes up relatively frequently. We'll compare that to System Center. We'll then look at another key area, which is around the move from per processor to per core, and then the benefits of software assurance, why you may look to get that, where the value may be for you, or why you may need it as a prerequisite. We'll see how that then can be leveraged into Microsoft Azure. So we'll look at how do you actually license Azure in itself, what the different models are, what your different options are, and then really how we can leverage that value, so the hybrid use benefits of licensing your Windows Server data center on premise, and how you'd actually license that Windows Server in the cloud with Azure, and perhaps in that hybrid model as well. And at the end, we'll cover off any other questions that we have. Like I say, we'll probably, this is a very hot topic at the moment, because I think still 70% plus of organizations still very much making that move into infrastructure as a service. So we'll probably get through this in the next 20 minutes or so. So the first thing we'll really need to look at is that Windows Server 2016. There are a reduced number of versions compared to Windows Server 2012 R2, and specifically today what we're really talking about is Windows Server Standard and Windows Server Data Center Edition. That's not to say Windows Server, the free Windows Server Essentials, isn't still relevant or available. It absolutely is. But for the majority of this webinar, I'm really referring to those commercial instances, those non-free instances of Standard and Data Center Edition. So when we are looking at them, and we'll cover off a little bit the difference between the functionality in a moment, but ultimately we're here to talk about the fact that you now need to license all the physical cores when it comes to the data center licensing. But that does not mean you don't have to buy the CALs as well, the client access licenses, because you absolutely do. And like I say, these slides will be made available at the end of the webinar. So if some of them are a little tricky to read, then don't worry, you will get them at the end of the webinar. But the key point here is that every single physical processor, all the physical processor cores, needs to be licensed if you're wanting to run Windows Server. That can be with either the Standard or the Data Center Edition, but regardless of the edition, all those physical cores must be covered. And in actual fact, there is a minimum requirement of that being at least 16 core licenses. That's really, really important to understand, because actually what they're saying is that's a minimum of at least 8 cores per processor. So with a minimum of 16 cores, and we'll run through that core to processor, processor to core rather, model a little later on. But the point being that there's really, what would it cost you to license for 2 processors in 2012? Now the similar cost, the same cost would be to license for 16 cores with Windows Server 2016. Another key point is for those organizations who have software assurance, which was covering Windows Server, and when that software assurance is due for renewal, there is basically an opportunity to take advantage of that if you require additional cores. Like I say, we can cover it off because a lot of organizations now are finding that their software assurance is coming up for renewal. So that's been in the last 12 to 18 months, and certainly we're seeing it come to a point now as well. Excuse me. Effectively, if you have software assurance on your Windows Server, this kind of safeguards you in the future. So if you had software assurance on Windows Server, you're effectively protected from moving to this new model, this new per core model, until you come to renewal. Now that you're at renewal, you should really be able to continue to run the same licenses to cover the same server and the same processing power. So if you are having a server which is greater than 16 cores, greater than those 8 cores per processor, then Microsoft will actually grant you the additional licenses. There is some documentation verification required, but they will grant you those extra licenses. What you would need to do, however, is make sure you do still continue to cover those with software assurance. Excuse me. But before we get too much into that, I did want to cover off some of the feature overview and comparison as well, because, and I have included essentials here in this table, but really we're looking at the Data Center and Standard Edition because they're both licensed in the same way. And really, as in previous versions, the main difference between the two is absolutely the number of virtual machines that each one permits. With Data Center, that's an unlimited number of virtual machines, and with Standard, it's 2 virtual machines. Now, if you're choosing to license the physical processors with Standard, that provides you with that instance only, and then when you start stacking the licenses on top, that's what provides you with the additional virtual machines. With Essentials, it's just simply 1-for-1 in every case. And as you can see, there is some additional benefits for having Data Center, namely the network stacking and some of the shielded virtual machines. But things like Nano Server and the Windows Server Container and all that core functionality of Windows Server is available in both Data Center and Standard. So relatively high level, but again, probably just worth covering off. And something else which actually comes up quite a lot is actually how you access this licensing. What we're talking about is licensing the data center, is using that licensing in Azure, but it is important to understand all the plethora of different ways you can actually access that product itself. How you can actually access Windows Server, Standard or Data Center. And really there's 2 ways you kind of access the server. One of them is obviously with a client access license, and then the other would be with an external connector license. For example, your client access licenses for Windows Server, every single one of your users would need that CAL as a base requirement, which provides obviously AD and all of that access. And for anyone not familiar, when it comes to CALs, you can basically buy per user or per device. But then you've got all these other ways of accessing it. Perhaps you are someone who is not an employee of your company, or you are, but you work remotely, or actually you want to have greater control over those users or have that identity manager piece. So there are the remote desktop services. There is the additional RMS, that rights management services piece, all available as CALs. But what happens is you always need to purchase that Windows Server CAL as that base CAL, and then if you wanted to access a virtual application, then okay, you would need the RDS, the Remote Desktop Services CAL, and that's classed as an additive CAL, because you still need to buy that on top of that Windows Server base CAL. If actually you want to have Windows Identity Manager, then that would be another additional CAL that you would need to purchase on top. Now actually with the Identity Manager piece, if you're just looking to do the synchronization, some of that is actually included within the Windows Server CAL. So it's important to really define and profile the users just to make sure you absolutely buy the right category of license. But again, that's something which you can take up with your licensing consultant. Contact me or contact your Ultima account manager. When it comes to the external connector, if you do not know who your users are and you want to permit access to your clients, to your partners, to the greater public, then they still need to authenticate you by that Windows Server external connector license, and then you don't need to worry about the cows because you don't know who those individual users or devices accessing that server are. You would then potentially want to have a look at the external connector for remote desktop services if actually you're looking to provide a desktop to those non-employee users. Again, that would be the additive with that Windows Server external connector as that base license, and then the other RDS services or rights management all being additive, obviously on top of that. So that is something which does come up a lot, and it's something which shouldn't get lost in the bigger picture. Making sure you've got the right server licensing is crucial, but also making sure you have the right access licenses. It is a bit of a, and will always be a bit of a gotcha, usually around the RDS, usually around the access to virtual applications where you need the RDS CAL. By the way, if you're doing a remote desktop service, that licensing actually sits on the Windows 10 enterprise type license. But we see a lot of similarity always between Windows Server and also System Center. Again, because System Center comes in that standard and data center model, it has the same licensing model as Windows Server, and therefore it's actually had the same change. That processor to core change has actually been the same. So again, you still need to license all of those physical cores with System Center. And again, you actually need to license each user a device for those who need to access the System Center client management suite. There's a slight change there. If you're just using System Center to license the server, you just buy the server licensing. There's a separate product if you need to license the individual user for running non-server related issues such as configuration manager to patch the desktop, for example, to deploy that. And then you would need to buy individual CAL type-based licenses. And therefore we see a lot of similarity in the core infrastructure suite where you would buy Windows Server and System Center bundled together, and you're going to save yourself about 40% on that System Center license if you require that. And really, if you're doing high density virtualization, that's where you want to be able to manage it. Virtual Machine Manager, Operations Manager, all those elements of System Center. Just thinking regarding how much detail to go into regarding the client management licenses, it's probably worth paying attention to that, but I don't want to run into it too much. I've made note that the client management suite is sold separately to Configuration Manager, but again, that's when you're suddenly looking more at the user and their desktop, as opposed to what this webinar is about, which is that server management piece. But it's important to realize they are two different products when it comes to System Center. But if you're managing and licensing the data center, it's obviously the System Center data center or standard licensing you want. So this is really one of the key areas here, which is that move, that transition from per processor to per core. So across the top, what you can see here in this diagram is the processor core count. So whether it's 2 cores per processor, whether it's 4, 8, and so on. As you can see across the bottom, the minimum requirement is to always license up to 16 cores. So you have the option to cover that off in a standard 16-core pack, but actually you may have a processor, you may have a 10-core processor. You're going to have at least 2 of them, so it's going to be at least 20 cores on that physical server. So therefore, that's what you need to license for. You'd license for 20 cores. Those licenses are sold in kind of 2-core packs, so you can do that in a stacked basis. You can stack those licenses on top. I mean, or you can buy it in a 16-core pack. The price is the same. And like I say, in this new world of per core licensing, to license for 16 cores is kind of the same cost as it would have cost you to license for those 2 processor licenses. Now suddenly if you've got 10 cores or 12 cores or 16 cores per processor, you'll be looking at a sudden uplift having to, if suddenly you have to license for 32 cores as opposed to 16, you're thinking, well, actually my licensing is going to double in cost to license that data center. So Microsoft, there is a license verification piece, and as long as you make sure you take a snapshot of your Windows server before expiration, take a snapshot with the time and the date, showing there's active core processors running on that server, which is licensed, which is coming up for renewal. Take a snapshot of that and keep that. That's your license verification piece. There is some free tools that Microsoft provide. You can use any asset management tool really, as long as it takes that snapshot. You can submit that to Microsoft. You don't submit that to Microsoft because Microsoft won't keep a copy. You submit it to your partner. But the key requirement would be for you to keep that. And those licenses, those extra licenses to get you up to 24 cores, 28, 32, those extra licenses are granted. That's not in perpetuality. So you would need to keep active software assurance running on those additional cores. So there is an uplifting cost, but those extra licenses are granted to you as an organization. And that's the piece where it's really important to get it right. And then we start thinking around, well, actually, this is the licensing, and then I've spoken a lot about software assurance, and there is a lot of value within software assurance, especially when it comes to licensing the Windows Server data center. You'll get all the expected benefits, and I'm not going to go through them one by one with the new version rights and the problem resolution support, the fact that if you have Windows Server standard with active software assurance, you can kind of step that license up to data center. So again, helps protect that price for you, protect that path to upgrade and have maximum flexibility. One of the best benefits is backup for DR, where it provides you with those additional servers running off site for DR purposes, as long as that other server is cold and it's just going to be used for that replication piece. Then it can spin up and then is subject, in the case of disaster recovery, it is subject to the 90-day rule, which effectively means you can move the license to that, but then you can't move it back again for a period of 90 days in that disaster recovery scenario. But one of the best benefits I wanted to cover off, one of the newest, most valuable benefits, really protecting that investment you've made in Windows Server Data Center with software assurance, is the Azure hybrid use benefit. And this is literally a way to save up to 40% if you are looking to move into the cloud, if you are looking to leverage that investment and move into Azure, where you can effectively have the base cost of that Windows machine in Azure already paid for, because you're leveraging that additional investment you've already made in software assurance. And it's really worth kind of focusing on that piece. It's really worth kind of understanding what that hybrid use benefit is, because what it enables customers with Windows Server standard and data center licenses covered with software assurance, they leverage that investment as they transition to the cloud. So you can upload your own Windows Server images to Azure to effectively a non-Windows VM. There are some, and actually it saves about 40% of the cost. There are some differences between standard and data center, mainly being that with standard, that could not be used concurrently on premise, as well as with the hybrid use benefit. So if you were running those virtual machines on premise, and then you'd effectively take them to Azure, so you wouldn't be able to have that. It's a hybrid use benefit, but what you're doing is you're taking the standard license, moving it from on-premise without having to buy any additional licensing within that 3-year term, and you're leveraging that within Azure. Then when that comes up for renewal, you may look to license that differently. So a lot of organizations, because of that slight restriction around standard, just means that Windows Server Data Center provides greater flexibility. We already know that it gives us unlimited number of virtual machines, and actually with software assurance, You can continue to have that unlimited virtualization on premise, but then actually leverage all that value within Microsoft Azure as well. And Datacenter is about 5 times the cost of standard, of course. So with every core license covered with software assurance, every 16 cores, which we spoke about, effectively gives you one 16-core server within Azure, or 2 virtual machines with 8 cores each. And then each additional set of 8-core licenses you buy effectively gives you another virtual machine with up to 8 cores within Azure. But it's probably worth covering off the, how to license Azure as well before we get too far ahead of ourselves. And there's a lot of solution specialists certainly, excuse me, certainly at Ultima can help with this. We have pricing calculators and making sure we really diagnose how best to license whichever workloads you want to put into Azure, whether that's just hosting some virtual machines, doing some DR, or whether there's the more complex workloads, let's say, and hosting things like well, a variety of different services and workloads. Brilliant how you can't think of any when you need to. There's an option between EA and CSP. Effectively, EA is where you would make a commitment where you'd pay annually, and then CSP, which is the one where you pay monthly, no price protection, but is managed by the partner and is more of an arrears-based consumption model. I'm just covering off in this in more detail now. So really, if you think about the 3 ways to purchase Azure as being, one is through an enterprise type agreement. It's actually called a server and cloud enrollment, or an SCE. The other new model is something called CSP, which I mentioned a moment ago, the cloud solution platform, which is managed by a partner, done on a monthly basis. And then the other is via the credit card, direct on that Microsoft portal. So if we start thinking about the minimum purchase requirements for each option, with with CSP and with online subscription, it's probably what most organizations start with, because there is no minimum. Certainly CSP, there is potentially a lot of attraction. It's a slightly higher price point, but what you're effectively you're paying monthly in arrears. And some of the other functionality you don't have as well, that is supported by the partner. So some organizations start off on that CSP path just to try and understand what Azure can do for them as they look to grow and build out their workloads. Excuse me. Then really, I think a lot of organizations see the value in the enterprise agreement, the server and cloud enrollment I mentioned before. And that does have a minimum requirement. You kind of have to start with, it's 10 monetary commit units per month, which effectively works out to be about £9,000 a year, £10,000 a year. Now, Microsoft, it's very much a hot strategic focus for them in their FY18 for them. So there are additional funding and fast track payments and various other ways that Microsoft can help incentivize you to increase that commitment. Although 100%, once you've hit that monetary commitment, it's all up front for the year. But then you can absolutely, even if in month 2 or month 3, you're exceeding what that commitment was, you're not going to be punished for that. It's not going to be an additional charge. You simply go into your overage. And then if you reach 150% of whatever your annual commitment was, you'll be moved to quarterly invoicing. So some organizations choose to take an Azure SCE because you're price protecting yourself for that 3-year term. They make a minimal monetary commit to begin with, maybe at £10,000, and then that satisfies for the first 6 months, or maybe it doesn't. So they get to the end of the year, then they can effectively move that commitment up or down. If they obviously hit that minimum commit earlier, then they would go into overage. There's no penalty for that. There's no additional charges for that. And if they hit 150%, it's only at that point that would simply spill over into quarterly billing. And then when you get to anniversary, you refresh, you reanalyze where you are, and you decide what that monetary commit is going to be for year 2 and year 3. So although an EA is a 3-year commitment, it's a 3-year term, a 3-year agreement, you can adjust it annually, up or down. You can actually choose to make more of a higher upfront commitment and get Microsoft's benefits in doing that. but is it really within the enterprise agreement that you start seeing the benefit from the hybrid use rights as well? It doesn't, hybrid use benefit doesn't really apply to the online subscription or CSP. It's for that EA model. Save up to 40%. So suddenly the EA model does look probably like the most value, certainly longer term, certainly as you're looking to make more of a commitment. You have access to the Azure Enterprise Portal and full Microsoft support, as opposed to, well, no support with the credit card and partner support, which is great. Use our TSC, our NOC, for that support piece. But there's something else which the EA offers, which a lot of organizations are taking advantage of, which was something called previously compute pre-purchase, is now called reserved instances. And this effectively means that, again, if you're able to really dedicate and identify which workloads you want to run in Azure, on what size and power capability of virtual machine, and then stick to that machine, we can actually bring that cost down for you further by reserving those exact instances of that exact machine within Azure. As opposed to just a general commit where you can use every single service. So again, we can monitor this as we go. We do have something called the T+12 model as you look to commit to Azure, where our solution specialists get involved and really start to diagnose how best to use it, and then we can, whether that's through trial, whether that's through CSP, or whether that's through an engagement model. So when you're making that commitment to the enterprise agreement, that 3-year commitment, we can leverage the value you've already made in your on-premise Windows Server data center. But not only that, and that saves you 40%, but not only that, we would look to see if we have any reserved instances to bring that cost down further for you. Now, as you acquire more memory and you may move away from that particular size or capability box, then you would lose some of the benefits of the reserved instances. So it is important to use the Microsoft pricing calculator, or more likely engage your partner and solution specialist to talk you and walk you through that, and then engage in a T+12 type model where you analyze and constantly refresh, certainly on a quarterly basis, what workloads you're using, and are you actually managing this and licensing this in the cheapest way possible. And that's a constant review piece as well. But certainly, as more and more organizations start building out infrastructure or platform as a service, or even just hosting virtual machines, then this will become very relevant for you. So like I said, it's a pretty high level, very high level introduction, just scratching the surface there. But the key point is that processor to core model, the benefits of software assurance, and then leveraging that within Azure as you want to. And by using data center with software assurance, to be frank, it just gives you that flexibility. I know it's 5 times the cost of standard, but it just gives you that flexibility to manage unlimited number of virtual machines on premise, then also save that benefit as you look to push out into Azure potentially. But that's not to say you would not have a mixed environment. There's still be instances of Windows Server Essentials there. You still need to make sure you get the access licensing correct as well, and don't trip up with any RDS cows. But again, that's where your solution specialists, account managers, and licensing consultants can help. Like I say, the webinar has been recorded, so it will be sent out afterwards. Thanks very much for joining. Do you have any questions? Okay, no problem at all. That brings the webinar to an end, and please let me know if there's anything else you'd like to know. More than happy to look at this in more detail when relevant for your organization. Thank you for your time.